So to get back to this question, there's two questions. One is intervention, and in the context of you talking about those early years and what it was like around him and how he did describe in detail, exactly how the devotional groups should be run, for example. The format of how a devotional group should be effectively run. I recall him describing that, for example. It's fairly straightforward. You talk about the actual process of him, locating him in instructions, whatever it is, the group reflects back to you, potentially what they hear you saying, and maybe they provide some insight. Try doing this, try not doing that, practice that with that for a week. Come back the next week. Somebody writes notes down, what the agreements were that were made. The following week you arrive and you talk about what came up in the context of taking on those, what are called yamas and niyamas. That's what I recollect him talking about. It's a fairly simple and straightforward thing, right? Is that what you recall him describing more or less?
Yes, well, he lived that with us. So this is what we had. The first time I began to experience and note that he was instructing us in this way is we had what was described as emotional sexual history dialogue with him, where we sat down in the room. And at this point in time, there were 9 of the women who were serving him most directly, acknowledged as an order around him. And then there was also a number of men who were likewise doing that. It was beginning to form a bit, but just in terms of the formality of the form that it would take in terms of the aspects of the process that needed to occur in direct relationship with him. So he showed us how to do this directly with him by participating with us. So I had my particular process of sitting in front of him with others there, him in the circle with us, or sitting in a chair, whatever the configuration was, and he's tell me about your life. Tell me about your life in detail. No taboos. There's no right, there's no wrong about what you say at all. Okay, just tell me about your whole life. Talk to me about it. And and these are recorded, by the way. They're in the archives.
That's how I experienced him. He asked me just to write, unfiltered, no taboos. Where is that gone? It just breaks my heart, because that's the beloved that we both knew.
Yes. Well, it isn't gone, because we can still do it in the context. Yes. And it will come to pass that it will be understood that there are errors that are still being made in relationship to what is considered to be the formalities or the form or the pattern in relationship to him. And so many thousands of people are aware that this is not it yet. So you're not alone in this observation. And even those who are participating in the so-called formalities that are where the institutional aspects, both legally and financially and organizationally and with authority, all of that is being executed by just a number of individuals who only have a specific perspective or point of view about it.
Can I say something though, Julie?
Wholly and fully yet.
Yeah. So I just want to say something. I appreciate the vision of what it was like when he was guiding, because I do regard him as the source and the sole governing authority, essentially, of what is right with him. And so for me, it doesn't serve me to rehash why it's wrong or what's wrong, or like, it's a little bit like case talk. Who cares? It's so arbitrary, because it's literally one fabrication over against a million different interpretations. It could have gone a million different ways. This is what happened. Oh,
Yeah.
well. Okay.
Yeah.
But for me, I constantly have been so blessed to have him reinsert himself
Mm,
as the
mm,
guiding force. And so for
yes.
you to describe in detail what it was like when he was alive and
Mm,
doing this and, with 9 women, not
mm,
just one in the room, but
mm,
9
mm,
is a
mm.
beautiful inspirational vision for how can 9 women, men, what have you, be in a room together and duplicate that pattern that he did with you.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. And well, we do experience that when we are actually in right relationship to truth itself, like with beloved. Beloved is obvious in the room, and there is the recognition, response of devotion, not as relationship to him as though he's an other and it doesn't apply. It's like the satsang is felt tangibly. We're in together in that room. Conflict is resolved. Differences are resolved. So that's the nature of the consideration that we would have with him. But becoming dependent upon his physical body and him being physically in the room, to have that be duplicated is what is still being transcended. What those forms of attachment and forms of superimposing I other notions on him when he was physically alive, we have to embody that, what he describes as instrumentality of his person, which requires a number of people being able to manifest the integrity of his person and
Right.
his manner, his word. Like his word is not objective,
Right.
like when in the devotional groups, the guiding force is the principle, his person, satsang
Right.
primary, and his word, and the integrity of that in relationship to one another. And the transcending then of what he demonstrated to us, there can be no taboos around what is communicated or what is said or what is presented, no superimposition of a presumed notion about what that means in
Right.
terms of the fact that that's arising for you, and for you to be afraid that you can't say something about what is arising. The distinction, if there's an actual effective process, as he just discriminately showed us his intelligence and ability to guide us, was that it wasn't the content that we were focusing on, but the content was something that we had to understand in terms
Right.
of right action to take in relationship to it, to go beyond that particular liability or even to incarnate that particular virtue. Thus, the yamas and the niyamas, to do or to not do, that both had related to limits or related to things that were something that you should magnify because of that's something where you can dance with beloved, or you have to transcend this because it's an obstruction
Mm.
in relationship to him, to the process, to truth itself, to as is. And so at the time, for example, like I ended up, every one of our little psychobiography of the ego in emotional sexual terms ended up having a title. And mine was called, you're going to really laugh when it was called The Mormon Flasher. Now you've gotten to know me a little bit and you can appreciate why that would be,
Yeah.
right? So how does one's virtue and liabilities then are the only way that this psychophysical entity, and that's just the superficial gross persona of the emotional sexual ego. There's all the different aspects of the ego that he actually then participated with each one of us to
Yeah.
help us see, observe, confess, understand, and go beyond through the application of right life disciplines, not the roteness of each person fits into this
Right.
program of doing it this way. You
Right. And
know,
also the
mm,
futility of trying to change some
mm,
fundamental patterns, which really isn't the point.
right.
What
You know
model
how
you
often he would
are.
say, no, you know how often he would say, I don't really like doing this, but well, beloved did it this way. Well, he would always say, don't do as I do as I say. In other words, you can't duplicate me, trying to guess what beloved would do in any of these situations, even though he did demonstrate it. Oftentimes when people will say, well, beloved did it this way, so that's maybe the way we should do it. It's not exactly that. There's a lot of errors in that assumption. or that because it was all divine play around him, then we can assume that everything is divine play now. There's very subtle nuances in terms of him saying, you know, how the ego is a really slippery son of a bitch, you know, in the sense that always misguiding you to make errors in relationship to the fidelity that's required to truth itself. So this is what, when he called me the Mormon flasher, it was like everything in terms of the two-sidedness, you know, the for and the against, you know, the hidden, or the one that's hidden and disciplined and religious, or the one that's the super Christian, you know, the born again or whatever, the religious fanatic. Then there's the flasher, you know, the one that wants to bear all. And you can see, like, okay, yeah, so I got this thing where I'm not afraid to be seen. Okay. And there's even something that I could get off on. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could be said about this particular persona. But what he did, he unleashed all of that so that there wasn't an uptightness about the fact of these ridiculous cartoon characters, which you very clearly know are play acts, you know. It's a myth, as you have characterized, you know. It is mind, it is all mind, until it is recognized.
Right.
And in recognition, then it becomes a creative ordeal, and artfully applied, a spontaneous moment to moment happening, in which are you allowing the divine to manifest, which is what Adidam always showed us through his physical embodiment in his person, is that no matter what we were considering, even the details of the obnoxiousness of my character, and boy, oh boy, did I get, like, he got so far deep into all the aspects and the qualities of hundreds of people, you know, and this was what provided the Leela of instruction. So everything that is written in his teaching didn't come out of the ether and he just spoke about it. It was always manifested in direct relationship. So must be now the part of manifesting through direct relationship to him, and him as everyone and everything. That's the secret. That's the secret. That's the aliveness of the Leela, keeping the Leela, the divine Leela, and the play becomes divine only when the ego act is transcended in satsang. So you're not making the fourth to fifth stage errors of all of this play is divine when it's just a dramatization of bullshit. So I'm going back to the point where you and I and many people can say, and even now in the present, there is a lot of dramatization of the ego act going on in association and conjunction with all of his gifts. And so when there is the emotional, like, how come it's not, you know, feeling this way as it was that you experienced when you were sitting with him and he directly instructed you about how to live the direct relationship to him. Personally, he did that with you. This is at the end of his life. So did he intervene? He intervened when always stated his intervention was direct, unqualified relationship. But in that moment, for example, in the recording that I made about how this occurred often, where before he would have, like the moment that somebody came running into the room and did something that was entirely obviously rude, he would have said something about it. Like, get the fuck out.
Right.
You know, that's bullshit. What the fuck are you up to?
Right.
You know, what's this about?
Right.
You know, go on retreat or do this or do that, or say to me, why the fuck didn't you, you know, make your position, make your situation known and say, that's not okay. You can't do that to me.
Well,
you know, I mean, there
would
be.
I'm not being accurate when I say I didn't see him intervene. I did see him intervene. I absolutely did. And I don't want to recount how I did see that. I did see him intervene. However, his intervention was sloughed off. It was not taken seriously by those immediate to the reception of it.
Yeah.
Therefore, to me, the messaging was he wasn't being serious.
Well, as he said, he was being ignored.
Okay.
And that's, yeah, he said he was being ignored. And this is, we were the ones who weren't taking seriously what he said to us. And as he indicated, because we thought, oh, here we are 20, however many decades later, and he's telling us, you're still beginners. You haven't realized anything, and it's not rightly aligned. And that's an affront to the ego, of course. And so he said that he observed more and more resistance to the yielding because we had become really fat of ourselves by virtue of association. That's why the characterization of Evelyn is this big
Yeah,
fat
really
character,
big
so
guy.
full of himself because of what has been taken from Raymond,
Right.
what has been taken on as if it applies to himself, Evelyn. But Evelyn's recognizing that I'm still animating the ego act here. I'm taking on the costume, but I'm still animating the ego act. And I know that's true. Why? Because it's true in my own case.
Mm.
Like the recognition, the radical self-understanding is always observing and understanding that liability, that error to take and to associate with what's apparently an other and to bring it into oneself to identify the dynamic of this condition within which we're rising. And it ends up not being a manifestation or creation of the divine process. The divine is lost in all of that. So he indicated that when he started to say that he could not submit or sacrifice his own bodily being to engage with devotees who were not prepared to make right use of them. That was what the 1986 initiated. And then as the years went by and the decades went by, he's always saying there was no response to that. Most all beings did not want to assume that right asana of submission, subordination, surrender, letting go, trust, real devotion in relationship to him as a Siddha Guru, because it was exactly what the ego doesn't want to do. So in the times when, at the end of his life, he said that he specifically said this, and I can't overemphasize this enough. He continued to maintain his bodily manifestation to be able to address what was going to occur after his Mahasamadhi. So the patterning that occurred around him, or the dramatization of egoity, which he did end up addressing because he was shouting about it, but he wasn't intervening himself to correct it because he said that was not his function.
Yeah.
He couldn't do that because his physical body wasn't going to be anymore. He kept calling accountability and the process of his extending of his authority to be able to be done lawfully. And he also indicated how that would be done lawfully.
Well, I
And
mean, I feel like
showed us.
the perfect parallel to that was he didn't make the proclamation of himself as the incarnation of God until it was recognized. Once it was recognized, he was able to then, and I understand that because when I'm considering something, if I have nobody who recognizes what it is that I'm recognizing and I don't have anyone to talk to, there's no purpose in talking about it. The moment there's a recognition, then and the energy can flow freely into a whole new process. So in that sense, I understand why he needed there to be the intervention animated by those who recognized what he was calling for.
Yes, yes, yes.
That has been interpreted a certain way. It's playing out a certain way. My confession in interfacing with it is that there is no way for what he initiated in his lifetime to go anywhere with it. It has no way to really flourish
Well,
in the context of my recognition of what he was calling for. I can't even have a dialogue about that.
Yes.
That's the other thing. It's like, okay, if there's something that's wrong with me, nobody will tell me what it is. Like,
right.
at least I could trust him to tell me, no qualms, what was wrong with me.
Right. As a liability that it was obstructing the process.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no shame, you
No,
know.
I
No,
want
no,
to
and
know what's wrong.
it wasn't like a criticism that you couldn't speak those things. Like
Okay.
you were a terrible person and he wasn't going to love you anymore and you were going to be shunned.
No, I wanted to see the devil in me so that it could be liberated. Show
Yeah,
what's
yeah,
wrong.
yeah. Going back to that point then of recognition,
Yeah.
it is the crux of it.
Yeah.
And this is spoken of from the very beginning, recognition, recognition, the way of recognition, you know, that it's all the same radical communication. And when he would the recognition he when what you were describing about this reciprocation, recognition is a reciprocation. It's in relationship. It is a relationship. And he also made abundantly clear that when we recognize the divine light and person in his bodily and as his bodily human form, even going beyond, because it would manifest and be clear that it was permeating in the space, all pervading, that it wasn't just exclusive to his body. He also then communicated to us in those moments when we were recognizing him, I am as you are.
Yeah.
He's not speaking to an other ego, I am as you are. This realization is not exclusive to this body. And, you know, he would say this New Yorker, this lump of meat, you know, pounding on his chest like this. It's not this. It's not the murti. It's not the objects.
No.
They're thresholds. They're icons.
Yeah.
They're murtis.
Yeah.
You know, the isness of the process is reality itself.
Yeah.
Everything else is secondary.
Yeah.
So if there's any form or formality that manifests in relationship to the true process, it is inherently fluid.
Yeah.
It's spontaneously arising. That's the Leela. That's the beauty. That's the love bliss. That's the responsiveness, the reciprocation, the allowing of it to reveal itself. It's not proven by the ego trying to prove the guru wrong.
Right.
But, you know, like the things that he said where he did address it. He like the note, all the detailed notes, all of the verbal dialogues that you heard him have with yourself or other individuals, being in the practice groups or when notes were given and meaning that he would communicate to one or two or others and then they would come and communicate, you know, what his word was or the recordings that were made that he was expecting everybody to listen to. He was otherwise previously he would have himself more. There weren't so much notes in the early days. He was in the room with saying these things directly to the individual so that there wasn't any complication around what he said. That the in between that would mess it up was gone.
Yeah.
So at the end of his life, it's like the in between. He was testing the in between, the seeming in between. You know, the ones who were supposed to be extending and authenticating. You see, and by the time of his Mahasamadhi, he said, only bare beginnings, signs. And yet there are no truly qualified instruments extending my authority, making it really clear that the people who were attempting to do that, all of us, meaning me included, anybody, was not lawfully aligned. And this is where we're at still, is in that transition of authentication to bring the whole into alignment so that it has a force of integrity as a cultural process, wherein the beauty of it, you know, in direct relationship to him with one another will manifest. I have no doubt whatsoever that it will. It's excruciating seeing the ugliness of the collective ego. You know, they're seeing the ugliness of the individual ego act that we are on, that only the apparent, that I have to take responsibility for the different aspects, but of my own being, seeming separate being, but I have to be responsible now for what I manifest in relationship. You know, that it is an inherent unity. The pattern is patterning. The dynamic that creates the patterning is a relational dynamic. It's an interconnected interdependence. So to actually come to about where there's a whole, there's a body of devotees. That's extraordinary. to have that manifest integrity. But that was what he said. That's what the true orders are,
Yeah.
or the congregations. So it's not that there's, and you can't have any mind about how that's going to manifest in advance, the actual integrity of it.
Yeah. You cannot.
Mm, mm.
Oh, I'm just trying to see how much time is left before it stops. So,
Yeah. Well, one thing is that we can keep talking also, but then on the other hand, too, there's if we want to have succinct, in terms of editing or whatever,
yeah.
recording put up,
Yeah.
then I guess it's best to not have a really long one. I mean, we can keep having really long ones, or just record it and break it up.
No, that's good. So I feel like, okay, so there's this intervention matter that we spoke about. There's the fact that, the difference between when you were living around Beloved and his pattern versus when I came in. And by the time I came in, there was all this Dharma. And I don't know if you had a chance yet to look at, I mean, for me, between the times that we connect, there's so much that's like,
Yeah.
that I'm processing, right? There's so much that's coming in that it's like, and then there's, of
Yes.
course, even in dreams and stuff that I haven't even begun to talk to you about what's transpired for me since I've been released from the institution, for a lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But it's as if there is a whole new process that I feel that I'm entered into altogether. So relative to that one recording and some of the points that I brought up, I think the main thing for me is comprehending, like one of the Leelas that you've told that I found profoundly instructive, and I don't know if other people have heard it. I know that it's out there, is when you were given instruction by Beloved, and it was the three of you, Ruchira, Dhammakonda, Sukapur, Naikanta, and yourself. And what I received from that was that there was this tangible expectation that because you all had relied so heavily on him to provide that direct instruction, that direct guidance, that direct intervention, and he was no longer, I mean, this was 1996, right? So not
So
quite.
this is Saw Lavananda Mahal when I think it was Quandra Mama before, but Tumo Mama.
Yeah.
But the Quandramai when that was and it was also when Pi was coming, was possibly entering into that sphere with Beloved too, and serving ladies and the men and the Dasya Mandala. Yeah, another attempt to establish an order, which again, form and order. How does that manifest in the reality process?
Which I really genuinely felt I understood that that's what he was wanting. And I expected that that's what the context of my relationship would be. So that, just leave it at that. In any case, my understanding from you is that his expectation was that the three of you would hold one another accountable. And
absolutely.
And that in essence would set him apart.
Yes.
But there was, but that didn't happen. So and I know that also there have been a similar Leela within the years right before his lifetime, similarly three women around him, in which two of them did try to animate that kind of accountability. And the third one refused it. So the inability to be held accountable within the context of a sacred order, in effect, never set him apart. And it always made him having to deal with one person as the only, and that for me, like I have certainly felt, okay, this is what happened. No knowledge of any of this, no comprehension, no understanding, a complete, oh shit.
The timing? or something else?
Oh yeah, the timing, sorry. I'll edit that part. The whole shit, it's all going to
Fine. Yeah, right.
shit. TikTok. The world is
Time,
ending soon.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, so essentially the fact that that never really fully incarnated as a demonstration of this comprehension, this understanding, it to me within his lifetime is significant because there isn't the context which he even describes in printed books using words,
Mm.
which psychologically I will confess is very confusing because he will describe in his literature what the expectation is of the form of this sacred life, and there's no experience of it to correlate it to, no direct experience of it. There's
Mm.
kind of a
Mm.
template,
Mm.
but
Mm.
no evidence of that template.
Right. So you do, though, however, as you have indicated, is that in the context of certain relationships and certain situations in which the primacy of what is occurring is the recognition responsive devotion.
Yeah.
In other words, radical root devotion is actually being felt.
Yeah.
Not doesn't have anything to do with mind or what is arising, but it's very clear. This is the context within which we are relating to one another.
Yeah.
Even though the feeling of relatedness is transcended in relationship, there is no differentiation. We are still arising.
No, well,
And
so
so we are recognizing in recognition responsive relationship by virtue of being in satsang.
yeah,
So that is what has to be magnified. You see,
right.
that
But
that is what
that's the part of it that okay, that's absolutely true. The difficulty is when the person holding the microphone is reading into the microphone as if that is happening, and they are the ones that are claiming the authority that this is the way that it's supposed to be done, but there's no evidence associated with the words that they themselves are reading,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's where psychologically it starts to create a schism in the
Well,
being.
yes. Well, you're describing exactly what's happening with the body of devotees, that schism and
Right.
that conflict because of lack of demonstration, not just on the part of the authorities who are apparently to extend his word, but I noticed that it's happening because of what we were just speaking about before. The recognition responsive radical root devotion is actually not being practiced sufficiently for these apparent distinctions
Okay.
to be gone
And I'm
beyond.
going to vocalize what I feel is a beautiful Leela that demonstrates what you're talking about. There was
Mm.
a devotee who participated in the overnight revelations in Kauai with Beloved. And he was asking, there were claims of seventh stage recognition of him. And he asked this devotee, can you look at your intimate partner and recognize me? And this devotee said no.
Mm.
And Beloved said, then you're not seventh stage.
Mm.
Can you look at the foot of my bed and recognize me?
Mm.
This devotee said, no, then you're not
Mm.
seventh stage. So I feel like that is what you are talking about, the root
Yes.
recognition. It's not
Yes.
it's not wed to any particular form. It's wed to Beloved as he is
Yes.
in the
Yes.
context of relationship, in the
Mm.
heart,
Mm. Mm.
whatever and all that is arising
Mm.
in unqualified relationship with him,
Yes.
always,
Yes.
no matter
Always.
what,
Yes.
under every circumstance.
Yes.
There's no
And if that
context.
is true, you would see the demonstration of that, and it would manifest as no conflict.
Right. And it would just always be about this love relationship with him in
Mm-hmm.
every relationship, in every circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
It is
Mm-hmm.
always only that expression.
Yes.
That's my
Yes. And
recognition.
when we lived that with him, that is when he was pleased.
Yeah.
That's what gave him a life. if we lived that with him consistently, not just in the physical room, whatever physical room, and we were ceremoniously pretending, and then we'd go out the door and be assholes. He knew that we were being assholes outside the door.
Yeah.
You know, the details of the content so that he could precisely say to each person exactly what they did. He wasn't investing himself in that kind of psychism, but it was obvious to him that
Well, he
there
would
was the
feel it
lack of integrity.
in his
Yes,
body. He would feel it.
exactly. That's what I was sensitized to, because that was my primary service, was his body.
Yeah.
You know, that's why I'm so hypersensitive to the manifestation of the symptoms
Yeah.
that occurred in him, and I can feel it. That's how I feel it.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have anything to do with what we're saying to one another,
No.
you know, or even the form or the formalities or the patterning or the context or who's that or who's what or who's supposed to be playing what role. It's like just the fact that there is this dissonance in the whole is the indication to me that recognition is not sufficient. You know, and so the way as a culture hasn't actually really begun, and that's not a terrible thing to say. You know, there is a way to say this that doesn't create despair. It's a
Right.
necessary understanding, but the resistance of that understanding that requires you to relinquish your act, meaning the ego act and its permutations, um, you know, that the ego doesn't want to do that, and that the accountability is in not in whether or not you can tick off your checklist. It's in about actually what each individual must do to transcend the ego act.
Mhm.
And so when you're pointing to the necessity, that's the true devotional group. And you have to know the people in the devotional group sufficiently to be able to do that effectively. And that's why it's most effective for devotees to live in proximity, to live close enough to be able to, or even in ashram, if it's actually functioning truly as an ashram, in you know, households or cooperative situations. However, cooperative life is essential to
Yeah.
be able to actually serve one another. You can't live independently, and as he said, even those of us who were living with him in his house, in his ashram, he was telling us we weren't doing it. Understand that.
Right.
That is profound, to understand that. So what does it have to do with proximity in time and space? In the demonstration, it's important, but not relative to the transmission or the blessing being inhibited. The ego act inhibits that.
Yeah. Do you suppose that it's because there was still this kind of two-faced activity that was constantly happening? You mentioned
Inevitably, yeah. Inevitably, yeah. The duality. And speaking of the emotional sexual character, that's the dramatization of the emotional sexual character.
so devotees would come into the room with him, be able to recognize him if they were with his body, but if they weren't with his body and they were with other devotees, then they were not necessarily recognizing or relating to him as if he was present.
Well, that's what he was reflecting to us, that was insufficient. The recognition wasn't sufficient.
Right.
And of course, I like to shy away from generalizations because, of course, it's unique to each individual, and there's many circumstances in which that did manifest that recognition
Right.
response. That's why it's maddening.
Yeah.
It becomes maddening because those with whom I spent decades and decades with, well, it sounds like I'm about 200 years old, but I mean, decades with, you know, where I saw that, you know, not in the physical room with him, and seeing that even when in all different parts of the world when he wasn't present, even seeing it in people who were not even aware of his name. You know, I mean, the influence of the divine process itself.
Oh, yeah. No, I've certainly experienced that for
Mm,
sure.
mm, mm. And so our responsibility is to bring that consciously into feeling awareness in relationship to everyone and everything. And it's incredibly artful and enable. He said that the structures of the formalities are secondary,